Mark the edge of the bevel gear onto the top side of the gearbox. Using an 8mm drill bit, drill out the marked area. The drill should be centred on the edge of the bevel gear. Make sure the edges are clean from any sharp bits of metal. First of all, we want to shim each gear individually to the gearbox. We want each gear to be able to spin freely in the gearbox, but not have any vertical movement. Place the bevel gear into the gearbox case and close it up. Using a small screwdriver or similar, estimate the amount of shims needed to stop the gear from moving up and down. You will want to press and hold the gearbox case together to simulate that it's been screwed together. This will get you a better idea of how many shims need to be added to the gearbox. Add a variety of different thickness shims to each side of the gear. Shim the bevel gear until it no longer moves up and down but spins freely within the gearbox. If the gear does not spin freely, shims need to be removed from the gear. Remember to press the gearbox case firmly together. This will simulate that the gearbox has been screwed together. The gear should be able to spin easily and freely with very little force. Once the gear spins freely with no vertical movement, screw the gearbox together. This way we can fine tune the shimming. You may find that the bevel gear no longer spins freely as the gearbox is screwed tight. Go back to step 4 and repeat until the gear is shimmed correctly. The gear should have no vertical movement, but should also spin freely within the gearbox. Unscrew the gearbox and remove the bevel gear along with its shims. Make sure you keep them safe. Insert the spur gear, and as before, estimate the amount of shims needed to prevent vertical movement of the gear, but still leaving it free to spin. Add shims to each side of the spur gear until it no longer moves up and down but spins freely. Once the spur gear has been roughly shimmed, screw the gearbox together. This way we can fine tune the shimming. Test that the spur gear can spin freely within the gearbox. There should be no vertical movement. Go back to step 7 and repeat until the gear is shimmed. Remember, there needs to be no vertical movement, however the gear should spin freely within the gearbox. Unscrew the gearbox and remove the spur gear along with all its shims. Remember to keep them safe. Place the sector gear into the gearbox and estimate the amount of shims needed to stop it from moving up and down. Add shims to the sector gear until it no longer moves vertically but spins freely within the gearbox. Once the sector gear has been roughly shimmed, screw the gearbox case together. Test that the sector gear can spin freely with very little force. There should be no vertical movement. Go back to step 9 until the gear is properly shimmed. Unscrew the gearbox and remove the sector gear along with all the shims you have placed on it. Next, we want to shim the bevel gear to the pinion gear on the motor. When the motor is inserted, it will push the bevel gear up. This is the position that we want to keep the bevel gear. We will shim the bevel gear using the shims that we took off earlier. We want to add shims to the top of the bevel gear until the bevel gear no longer moves up and down. Then any remaining shims are to be placed under the bottom. This way the bevel gear is shimmed to the motor. Remove all shims from the bevel gear and keep them safe. We will be using them in the next couple of steps. Insert the bevel gear into the gearbox and screw the case together. Remember, there's no shims on the bevel gear at this stage. Using the hole we drilled out earlier, we can see the exact height of the motor in conjunction with the bevel gear. We want the edge of each gear to meet, this way we get the maximum tooth contact between both gears. I will be using a modified pistol grip, this way I can see the exact height of the motor in conjunction with the bevel gear. Insert the motor into the pistol grip and screw up the base plate. Press the pistol grip into the gearbox. Make sure you hold the pistol grip flat on the base of the gearbox. Adjust the motor height until the edges of the bevel gear and the pinion meet. Make sure the pistol grip is flat on the base of the gearbox. Now I'll be using the actual grip I'll be using on the gun. Insert the motor and use the base plate that we have adjusted. Press the pistol grip into the base of the gearbox, making sure that it sits flat on the bottom. Estimate the amount of shims that need to be placed on top of the bevel gear. Unscrew the gearbox. We want to add shims to the top of the bevel gear until there is roughly 0.1mm of vertical movement. This way the bevel gear is not tight against the motor. To fine tune the shimming, screw the pistol grip in, insert the motor and screw at the base plate. Test the amount of vertical movement above the bevel gear. There needs to be approximately 0.1mm of vertical movement. This way the bevel gear is not shimmed tightly to the pinion gear. Any remaining shims that are not used on top of the bevel gear are now to be placed on the bottom of the bevel gear. This way the bevel gear remains shimmed to the gearbox case. Now we want to shim the gear faces together as close as possible. This way we get maximum tooth contact between each gear. We want to shim the gear faces as close together as possible so that the gear teeth have maximum contact. To do this, I tend to start off with the gears slightly touching and then move shims from either the bottom or top until the gear spins freely together. Insert the spur and then the bevel gear into the gearbox. Make sure that none of the shims get mixed up. Looking at the gears from a low angle, move shims from the top and bottom of the spur gear so that the spur gear face just touches the bevel gear face. Close the gearbox case up with the bevel and spur gear inside. Make sure that you hold the case closed as if it were screwed together. This will give you a better idea of the shimming of the two gears. Test how well the gears spin together. If the gears do not spin, the spur gear needs to be shimmed lower. If the gears do spin together, it is most likely that the spur gear needs to be shimmed higher or closer to the bevel gear. We are trying to shim the faces of the gears as close together as possible. Just because the gears spin freely together, this does not mean that they are shimmed correctly. The gears may need to be shimmed closer. Adjust the shimming of the spur gear. We want the faces of each gear to be as close as possible without touching. To get the best result, move the gear in 0.1mm increments. Screw up the gearbox case using all available screw holes. Test that the gears spin freely for a number of rotations. Go back to step 18 if they do not. Make sure the gears are as close together as they can be. You may want to try shimming them closer. Once the gears are shimmed correctly together, unscrew the gearbox case and remove the bevel gear, and insert the sector gear into the gearbox. Make sure you keep all the bevel gear shims on the bevel gear and not inside the gearbox. Looking at the gears from a low angle, move shims from the top and bottom of the sector gear so that the sector gear face just touches the spur gear face. Close the gearbox case up with the gears inside and hold the gearbox case together. Using your finger, test how well the gears spin together. Remove the sector gear and adjust the shimming of the gear. We want the faces of the gears to be as close together as possible without touching. Screw up the gearbox case using all available screw holes. As before, test that the gears spin freely together for a number of rotations. Go back to step 23 if they do not. Once the spur and sector gear are shimmed correctly, unscrew the gearbox case and insert the bevel gear into the gearbox. Screw up the gearbox case using all available screw holes. Test that the gears spin freely together. They should spin for a number of rotations and there should be no grinding noises. The gears should be rotated very easily. The sector gear should also be tested against the piston rack. The sector gear should engage centrally on the piston rack. Be sure to visit airsofttutorials.com for further information on this tutorial.